Welcome to Climate Optimists. I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
So today's topic, we'll be digging into climate justice, what it is, and why it's important. And before we get there, what did you know before we started preparing for today's episode?
Well, probably not as much as I should have. I knew basic things from doing reading. And if you're looking at climate issues these days, I feel like climate justice is something that I see people talking about more, and I see more articles about it. And some of the episodes we've done, there's definitely been some issues that we've touched on at kind of a nation state level of,
Right.
climate injustice. But I'm excited to dig in more today and kind of get a more focused story and a more focused human view of the topic.
Similar to you, I was familiar with, what climate justice is at a basic level, kind of where the term came from, but I don't think I fully appreciated all the different facets of it. Your point about, nation states being impacted differently. I mean, it isn't just something that's kind of narrowly focused. There are all sorts of inequities when you talk about climate justice hitting different types of, geographic regions, different people, et cetera. And we'll get into that a little bit.
Right.
It definitely makes it a bigger topic than you can sort of squeeze into to one episode.
Oh, for sure.
So before we go there, wanted to highlight this week's reason for hope, which is the Biden administration has invoked the Defense Production Act to help boost battery production. And at a basic level, the focus here is getting companies to develop a domestic supply chain, focused on raw materials that are needed for lithium-ion batteries, stuff like, lithium, nickel, and other, precious metals.
Right.
As of today, there's only one operational lithium mine in the U.S. in Nevada. And while there's a lot of other sites that are being looked at, there's clearly a constraint in terms of being able to produce batteries. And batteries are critical both to, obviously, the electric vehicles that, folks are buying more and more, and as well as having batteries to address the variability of wind and solar. We've talked about it before, but if wind and solar are going to become our primary energy source,
right.
renewables in general, we've got to have batteries to help backstop them. So it's definitely a critical supply constraint. And yeah, I was excited to see that he's taken that step.
Yeah, it kind of leads me to a question about possible pushback from, the environmental groups on this, where you kind of, it's going to be interesting to see where you kind of have the climate groups that are, championing this effort, and then possibly the environmental groups who are normally mostly on the same page, possibly pushing back against, these mines going in anywhere in the U.S.
Well, I think it's a good question. And I think the reality is there's already pushback.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, at a certain point, folks need to be able to zoom out and look at the big picture, because while, mines can certainly have adverse impacts if they're not done responsibly, we've got a huge crisis in front of us that could have catastrophic impacts for everybody. And so, at a certain point, you got to look at what's the lesser of the evils, and
right.
accept the reality that, we as humans have a footprint, and we're going to have a footprint.
Yeah, there's going to be impact no matter what you do. Hopefully by having them in the U.S., you're doing a better service to the planet than maybe in some, other country where they're really not worrying about that too much, and they're kind of just trying to crank stuff out.
I agree. I think that while our environmental laws aren't perfect,
yeah,
to your point, I mean, there are countries that have very, very lax laws. So
right.
having them here and having them under more scrutiny is a good thing.
Yeah, I would hope so.
And I would think that there's got to be some really good lessons learned. I mean, we know what it looks like to do it poorly in the U.S. I mean, how many Superfund sites are there out there that are, created a result of mining? So hopefully we've learned our lesson. And while I think environmental groups need to be keeping the big picture in mind, that's not to say they shouldn't be calling for, sideboards and providing additional oversight. So I think that's good. I just think you can't say at the one hand we've got a climate crisis that we need to deal with, but then you're not going to be supportive of the solutions that we need to address the crisis.
Right. Yeah. Agreed.
So before we get into today's guest and our interview, I wanted to talk a little bit more about kind of the multiple dimensions to climate justice that we mentioned. You've got one category, which are, folks who are physically vulnerable. Those could be seniors, those could be people with chronic health conditions. And the reality is that they're going to be more adversely impacted with climate change, whether you're talking about heat waves or other things. And so there's a disparity there, right, that we have to be mindful of. You've got unequal financial resources, right? You've got people who have less money to go around, which means they're less able to cope with the threats of climate change. In the US, you can certainly see that with like after a forest fire or a flood, obviously devastating to anybody who goes through that. But if you're somebody who has, more financial means, it's going to be much easier to get through that to the
Right.
other side. And then you talked about this already, but then, the fact is there are national differences. And, we've got nations that are going to be impacted very differently, like island nations where sea level rise could literally wipe out entire countries. You've got hot areas that are barely inhabitable now,
Right.
and as climate change worsens, may no longer be. And then there's this unfortunate reality where we have kind of the wealthy countries that have done all the polluting and benefited from, the energy that fossil fuels have provided. And those countries are much better positioned than the countries that have contributed very little when it comes to climate change.
Yeah.
And then I think sort of the fourth category are racial disparities. So,
Mm-hmm.
in the US, you've got minority populations that have historically been located in areas that are more prone to floods and experience higher pollution. And now you know, you're going to accelerate a lot of those impacts. So it's complicated, right? I mean, the reality is there's multiple dimensions to this.
Yeah, for sure.
So our guest today is Senator Lew Frederick. Lew is an Oregon state senator for District 22, which covers parts of North and Northeast Portland. He was the Senate Majority Whip in the most recent session, has been serving in the legislature since 2009. And when he's not in session, he works as a strategic communications consultant. He's served on numerous boards, including the State Board of Education, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. He's also a PhD candidate at Portland State University, and prior to being a lawmaker, worked 17 years as a television reporter. So excited to have Lew on the program. Well, Senator Frederick, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Thank you very much. I like the title.
So let's start you off with a basic question. When you think about efforts to address climate change, what gives you hope?
Well, that's a good question, because a lot of folks would go into the sort of cynical realm within this. What gives me hope is that I think we're starting to see people acknowledge that, in fact, we have both an issue and that we want to try to solve the issue. A lot of people are no longer just accepting the sort of merchants of doubt approach to dealing with issues, and that's what gives me optimism.
So I guess when thinking about communities of color and climate change, do you see unique challenges that communities of color are facing? How is that different from maybe other demographics?
Well, there are past issues, there are future issues, and then there's the approach that we've seen recently. The past issues include placing communities of color in places that have high pollution issues, that have low possibilities of use of energy well, so that you have old homes with no insulation, basically, using oil as the primary heating source. Many years ago now almost 15 years ago, a plane flew over Portland, North and Northeast Portland, where we live, and it took pictures during a snowstorm, took pictures of the homes and determined which houses were letting heat go through the roof, literally. And so they could see that, and they then the people at Portland State went and identified those homes and tried to get help for those people to get insulation put into those homes. Well, that was a good idea. We still need to do that kind of thing. We still need to understand what's going on coming through the windows, through the walls. We need to understand what kind of water usage is taking place. We need to have a good sense of the electricity usage as well. We have those issues. We have issues regarding asthma in the neighborhood. That's been a clear situation with diesel fumes. So we're starting to finally address some of those issues, both with the use of electric vehicles and with getting engines that can actually burn it a lot better so that we don't have to worry about that. So we have a lot of things that people are working on. For communities of color, the approach has been in the past, let's get some people who are early acceptors to go and buy expensive devices or something like that, and everyone will then supposedly follow along and do that kind of thing. We need to,
Right.
we've slowly gotten away from that to some extent, but we still have that as a model that people want to take, and we need to address that and let the communities of color, low-income communities, understand that they can do better. But the issue is really, how do we provide the resources for folks to actually use the new approaches to dealing with environmental issues, as well as giving people options that are viable and understand what's going on. There's another issue, though, that I think we really do need to deal with as well, and it's something that environmental community has been struggling with for some time, whether they knew it or not. They were struggling with it. It's paternalism. One of the biggest issues that I run into is folks saying, well, we know just how you should be living. You shouldn't be using this particular product, or you shouldn't be doing this or that, because you should be walking to the store rather than driving to the store. Those kinds of things, or a particular kind of food, or things like that. The paternalism is a real serious issue because, frankly, many of the minority communities and low-income communities are doing the best they can.
Sure.
This is they're trying to get by. If you don't provide inexpensive things to do, they're going to use what they can to get with what they need to have for their homes and for their families.
Yeah, that's got to be frustrating. I mean, I don't think anybody likes to have somebody come in and tell them how they need to live their life, or the way that they're living their life could be better. And it sounds like, too, if I'm hearing you, there's climate change, and the impacts of climate change are just coming, right? We're just starting to see, more heat waves and wildfires and flooding, and that underserved communities, struggling communities, were already in a bad place to begin with. They already were next to historical pollution sources and so forth. So they're starting out, with the deck stacked against them, going into a situation where, all these types of impacts are going to be more frequent and severe.
Well, I think you're right there. But the other thing is to try to find out what it is these communities actually need. One of the basic things is jobs. And there are jobs available setting up charging stations, not only charging stations that are commercial charging stations, but residential charging stations, putting on solar panels. You can do a lot of those things with relatively little initial education or training, but you can then take that training and that education and to another step, creating your own businesses to have those jobs available so that you are able to afford other things and not be stuck. We need to be thinking about, what is it that, asking the folks who are in those situations, what is it that you need, rather than telling them what they need.
Right.
That's the difference. And I think we can do that, but we have to come forward with a statement that says, we aren't outreaching to you. You're one of us. You're part of our community. You're here. What is it that you need that we can help with? What is that you have that you can help us with?
So it sounds like the best first step in many ways we can be making is, approaching disadvantaged communities that are going to be more heavily impacted, and just starting with listening, right? Rather than coming in with prescriptive solutions.
Absolutely. I think the listening is going to be a key. Now, there are now people who have stepped forward from those communities. There is a environmental professionals of color group in Portland that regularly meets, passes along job possibilities, passes along information about recent grants, other information about different places in Boston or Atlanta or Chicago that are doing certain things, and they try to bring some of those ideas to Portland. So there are people out there ready to go if things are available, and they're making things available. So if there are folks there, it's a matter of actually connecting with people as equals, not as if they are less than, that you need to support them. It's a matter of saying, okay, what is it that you need, and how can we work together to make North and Northeast Portland, Southeast Portland, places in La Grande, in Ontario, on Coos Bay. How do we work with folks so that we provide good resources? Coos Bay is looking right now at offshore wind and offshore wave energy potentially. What does that mean to the folks who are there? What does that mean to the native tribes who are there? What does that mean to the Latinx and the Asian population that lives in that area? Will that have an impact on them in terms of jobs? Will it have an impact on their general livelihood? Will they become middle class within this situation, or will they continue to be just barely getting by? Those are the kinds of things that we need to be looking at, and that's what I spend probably way too much time on, but that's what I spend a lot of time just trying to understand what's going on in different places around the state. But in Portland, when we had the heat, we needed to have places available for especially for elderly folks, but also disabled folks, to go to get out of the 110-degree temperatures that we were dealing with, which was completely unusual for Oregon, from Portland. So we needed to have places available, and then find out how as we passed bills this session that allowed people to put in air conditioning in their rentals if they needed to, because in many cases they were not being allowed to do that, which makes no sense to me, but the landlords were saying that this was something they couldn't allow. So we passed some bills that said, yes, you can. Those kinds of things are the kinds of things we need to be looking at. Again, asking people what they need and finding out how to get that for them, and how to get that with them. That's the key element as far as I'm concerned.
So in a way, you've spoken to this already. My next question was really, what can be done to ensure our transition away from fossil fuels is just, and it sounds like starting first with understanding the needs of the community. In addition to that, ensuring that opportunities, economic opportunities that are available for the transition, whether that's putting up solar panels or, installing chargers for electric cars, that those communities get to participate in that as well. And so they're not only reaping the benefits of, let's say, having a solar panel on their roof, but being able to reap the benefits of being engaged in that transition. Are there other things that we need to be thinking about in terms of ensuring, a just transition away from fossil fuels?
It's a matter of not looking at an individual aspect, but looking at a whole, and understand that is involved with poverty, it's involved with education, it's involved with food deserts, etc. All of those things are part of a whole that we really need to be looking at. Some people are doing, but others, they need to see the forest for the trees at this particular point. It's sort of interesting because many of the environmental groups were talking years ago about the ecosystem. Well, this is an economic ecosystem in many cases, and you've got to look at all the pieces. They come together in more than the sum of their parts. One of my colleagues, Michael Dembrow, has been looking at how we can deal with the issues of diesel, and supporting the farmers and other folks who rely on that to get their goods to market. I mean, this is the other thing that many times I've run into folks not recognizing that in order to get things to the stores, they're using diesel trucks to do that. So let's be real clear about what that holistic approach is about. We need to acknowledge and work with the people who are doing their jobs. They're bringing green beans up from the central Willamette Valley on diesel trucks so that people can have green beans in Portland. I-5 and 205 and 84. If you go and you look, you can count the number of trucks moving through there because they're on their way to commerce either in Oregon or elsewhere. So we need to acknowledge that and figure out how to help those folks make a change to electric vehicles. Diesel trucks are not going to be going away in the next 2 years, no matter how hard some people would like to see that happen, because in many cases, those diesel trucks cost a whole lot of money. And at this point, we don't have the charging stations for either electric vehicles, especially electric trucks, and or hydrogen vehicles, which is another thing that's being suggested. So we're going to need to figure out how that transition takes place, how it's helped along, and who it's helping and who it's hurting. We had a long conversation in the Transportation Committee this last session regarding biodiesel and just whether it was effective, whether it created problems for the engines that it was being used in. Those kinds of things need to be addressed. But there are lots of policies like that constantly coming up. But we need to both look at the individual policies, the individual issues, as well as the holistic approach, the comprehensive approach, the ecosystem.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, it starting at the back end and really looking at what are the outcomes that we want for everybody in our community, and then backing into the policy solutions that support that.
I try to look at what is this particular policy, who is this particular policy helping, who is it hurting, and to what extent, and how do we address those issues so that no one is left out in terms of support and helping. That's how I try to look at it. Not always successful, but that's my goal within my approach to many of these issues.
Well, I guess one question at a national level, and I assume can be burdensome depending on the state legislation, is how do we design programs, the implementation of programs, to ensure that they're easily navigated? In other words, I was reading about the Biden administration, and they have, I think $50 billion set aside for helping make communities more resilient in the face of climate change. But the worry is, of course, that that's going to end up going to all the wealthy communities that have the resources to navigate the process. So,
absolutely a fair question, and it's one of those things we run into not just with climate change, but we run into it with education, with economic development. We run into it with housing. Who knows how to write a grant so that you can get the money for something like that? That is absolutely one of the biggest issues that we struggle with, and it's a matter of then looking at who's actually getting the money. We did that with the American Recovery Act money that came in. We started looking at who was not getting the money. Well, we found out that in fact a lot of Black businesses were not getting money because they did not have the same kind of historic relationship with the banks that other businesses did. And so we said, well, that's not okay. We're going to make sure that in Oregon, we're going to make sure that those businesses get money, additional money, because they were already behind in the first place. But it's a matter of monitoring that. We know what those disparities look like now, especially via this pandemic. We know what those disparities look like. Tracking where the money goes and who is not getting the money, who's not getting the support. It's going to take a while. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is now more transparent than it has been over the last few decades. So I'm encouraged by that. That's one thing. There's another thing. There are folks who use distraction as a way to make sure that nothing gets done, and we need to acknowledge that that's what's going on. I'm sure you've read. Have you read the Merchants of Doubt? Have you seen that book?
I'm familiar. I have not, unfortunately. It's on my long list of to reads. So,
well, you can read it. There's also a pretty good movie about it. But put simply, it is set up to try to find a way to both distract and to bring disinformation forward. You get confused. Okay, who's telling me the truth here? The classic example, of course, is the whole tobacco industry, where the tobacco industry knew for decades that they were selling and promoting a deadly product, but they kept saying, well, we have some scientists who say it's not, even though they knew it was not true. That's the classic. But we've had that take place with climate change. Exactly the same kind of thing. That's a distraction. That's the kind of distraction that I'm talking about. So we need to be able to watch for that and make sure that that doesn't happen. And that really comes back to another issue for me, and that is understanding what science is about. What science itself is about is something that we've gotten away from, and a lot of that is because we decided to take on a particular approach to education that said that science was simply regurgitating facts and not understanding that it is in fact a process. It is in fact something that people look at and they are able to develop hypotheses and test them and work through and understand that there always is going to be someone who's going to disagree with it, but that doesn't mean that they are actually their generation's Galileo. I'm going to be speaking shortly in a couple of weeks at a conference for science communicators, science journalists, because we no longer have as many as we once did. So understanding that in terms of science, understanding how media is presents science is going to be an important factor as well. So those are a couple of things that come to mind for me. Identifying distraction and understanding how we approach the issues of science and how we can use that in a way that's going to be effective, again, for all of us.
Given that, and I certainly, when you talk about the disinformation side of things, I've seen obviously reoccurring disinformation when it comes to climate science. Do you feel like in sort of where we are today that disadvantaged communities of color, that they have a robust understanding that they're getting the information they need to understand sort of what's coming with climate change and how best to prepare for that?
I don't think that anyone really has that kind of information at this particular point. I mean, and that's the folks, even the folks who are believe that they are very much up to date on that. Everyone's got to recognize that there's still a lot more to be learned, but it is basically humbling yourself to say we don't have all the information right now. Let's find out what it is we do know and use that to make the best decision that we can at this point, recognizing that it's not going to be the final decision, but it is a point in time that we can begin to think about decisions. That's the kind of approach that I think we need to see right now, in my view.
So with our podcast, we try to focus on giving opportunities for each of us to advocate and to help move climate solutions along. I guess as we think about, climate justice and how to make this transition away from fossil fuels a just one, are there things that we as individuals, can be doing to help with that?
I think that there are, and I'm going to go into a political state in some ways here. The fact is, we will be having a primary in May for a number of legislative elected seats: city council, county commissioner, metro, and state legislators, and governor, and others. We have all of those things taking place. It's going to be a good idea for you to know who is running, what their ideas are, and how they work well with others who have similar ideas. The whole scorched earth approach to elections should be discarded at some point, but we do need to figure out how we work together, how we govern, because governing is a different thing. Making sure that you understand who is out there, how they look at the issues in terms of governing, how they're able to work with people, even when they disagree, is going to be important, because that's the only way we're going to get something effectively done. We can continue the battles, or we can decide to get some things effectively done. And I think we've started to see some people become effective on things, and that's the key. So understanding who's out there. If you want to take the next step, of course, is to try to officially work with some of the people who are running for office, and see if you can help them as they're getting information from the general public about what needs to be done and how they can gain support. Those are individual issues that you can use. If you want, at the least, if you can give support either financially or by way of being on Zoom calls or whatever with people, that makes a difference as well.
Well, we're definitely all about political engagement here at Climate Optimists. So Great to hear you advocate for that. Well, Lou, thanks for taking the time to talk with us about, climate change and the sort of the historical disadvantages communities of color have had and kind of what they're facing as we enter an era when climate impacts are going to become, unfortunately more severe.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the chance to talk.
So, Todd, what were your takeaways from our interview with Senator Frederick?
Well, I didn't know that much about Senator Frederick, and I hadn't heard him speak. And he's obviously a very intelligent and thoughtful guy who seems to have a lot of care for his constituents, right? And I think it's obvious that we need a lot more Lew Fredericks out there. We'd be doing a lot better if we did.
Agreed.
I did look a little bit more into some of what he talked about with diesel and asthma. And in 2016, there was a Dirt on Diesel report from the Oregon Environmental Council, and it found that the 10 lowest income and 10 highest minority census blocks experience more exposure to all sources of air toxins than the average group does. And in Multnomah County specifically, the census tracts with a higher average of Black, African American, and Asian Pacific Islander and Latino residents have 2 to 3 times more exposure to diesel particulate matter than census tracts with 90% or more non-Latino white populations. So there's obvious disparity there, right? That Lou was talking about. Another thing I remember hearing about this a couple years ago, and that was kind of the heat island idea, which is a problem all across the nation. It can be 5 to 12 degrees hotter in some of these lower income areas than it is in higher income neighborhoods, which is a staggering difference in number. And it's obviously probably not something that was consciously done, but gets back to these problems that I think Senator Frederick was trying to talk about. These are the results of years and years of discriminatory practices. What happens is there's fewer trees, parks, there's more asphalt exposed to the sun, and it causes these heat islands. And other than that, just he's also kind of a man after my own heart. I read his bio, and he's got actor and ranch hand in there, which is very similar to my background. I've dabbled a little bit in the Portland theater, and it would be cool to talk to him. Where I feel like we're kind of bosom buddies, and I've never even spoken to the guy.
Yeah, sounds like you guys would have a little bit to chat about.
Yeah, well, it's a small world, I mean, he mentioned LeGrand in Ontario. We don't even know him. We didn't queue him up for that, by the way. I was born and raised in Ontario. I went to school in LeGrand. It was just, I thought it was very interesting that those were the two cities he happened to mention.
I hadn't even thought about it until you just mentioned that. But, and of course our listeners are going, wow, where's LeGrand in Ontario? But,
Google it.
Yeah, a climate optimist, we're headquartered here in Portland, Oregon. And yeah, ironically, the two small towns town you grew up in and the town where you went to college were both ones that Senator Frederick mentioned. So
yeah, the other maybe the biggest part that struck me was when he started to talk about paternalism, and I think, well, I'm sure we're guilty of that in this podcast. Right? I mean,
we're pretty good at preaching.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to just sit there and say, well, this is what you ought to be doing. But I really liked his approach of saying, what do you need? It's like, it's hard to think about buying electric cars when you got lead in the water and all this stuff that nobody can seem to fix, right? So,
right. If you don't have the basics to begin with, why are you going to be concerned about riding your bike to get your groceries,
It's crazy. So
I'm wondering, as you talk about the paternalism and asking people what they need and instead of telling them, maybe that's something Chelsea would appreciate in your relationship.
Oh, I'm sure. Have you guys been talking or what? You do a lot of podcast episodes on that.
No, and not to make light of it, but I think you're right. Before we sort of step into kind of like solution mode and how are we going to move through this crisis, you really got to start to sit down to understand where a person is. You got to meet them where they are. Segue to another good point that I think he made, which is let's focus on creating economic opportunity for these disadvantaged communities, because that leads to all sorts of other benefits, right? Like if I have the chance to participate in the clean energy transition by helping weatherize homes or installing solar panels or putting in charging stations.
Yeah.
Not only am I getting, income that enables me to potentially leverage those same things myself in my own home, but that's no longer top of the pile in terms of what I'm worried about, right? So it seems to me that getting disadvantaged communities involved in this transition that we have to make and making sure that they reap the benefits is going to be essential.
Yeah, I agree.
So as we're talking about this, some might be thinking, we've got a long ways to go, which is true, but there are some promising developments that are starting to take place at a federal level. The EPA completed a pretty detailed report looking at climate change and social vulnerability this last fall, where they were trying to quantify differences in how races will be impacted by climate change. Sort of that, like, you got to start with understanding the problem before you jump to what solutions are needed.
Right.
And as some might be familiar, the Biden administration announced early in their tenure their Justice 40 initiative, in which the president promised to deliver at least 40% of overall benefit of federal investments in climate change and clean energy to disadvantaged communities, which, gets at what we were just talking about. So I thought those are both, positives as we sort of look at climate justice and the work that we have ahead of us.
Right. Obviously passing, Build Back Better, as we talked about on the show a number of times, is so important because you can't do any of this stuff without the money, right? And that's the world we live in. And so we're going to need to get legislation passed to move these efforts along.
For sure. And so this leads to the question of, as individuals, like, what can we do? And for this week, have kind of a little bit of a different flavor. Senator Frederick, I think, rightfully talked about the fact that if, you want to make a difference, that it's really important that we all get engaged in our elections. And so while it's hard to imagine, there is an election coming up here in November. And so, encourage folks to take the time to start looking at the candidates that are running for office, take a look at both sort of their stance on climate change and climate justice. And then I think equally important, as he mentioned, is how are they going to work with the other side of the aisle, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to have an awareness of a problem, but if you can't work with your other lawmakers, then nothing gets done and we see no progress. So
right.
I think taking a look on both those fronts is important. Well, thanks for tuning in today. I think that's a wrap. Come back next week for more climate solutions, reasons for hope, and ways each of us can make a difference. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimists.co. And don't forget to check us out on social at Climate Optimists Podcast.